You can't expect me to sit next to her. This is first class." The words sliced through the cabin like a jagged blade, laced with entitlement and disdain. Edward Langston stood tall in the aisle of Horizon Star Airlines Flight 819, his tailored navy suit pristine, a gold Rolex glinting on his wrist. He tossed his coat across seats 2B and 2C as if they belonged to him alone. Passengers in nearby rows paused mid-conversation, eyes turning. Aisha Carter stepped into the cabin moments earlier, unaware her presence would ignite a storm. Her white blazer was sharp against her deep brown skin, a brown leather tote nestled on her shoulder. At 42, the CEO of Nexus Solutions had navigated tougher rooms than this, but nothing prepared her for this open declaration of prejudice. "This is my seat," Aisha said quietly but firmly, holding up her phone. The boarding pass glowed clearly on screen. "Seat 2. B, first class." Edward barely glanced at it. "Surely there's been a mistake," he said with a sneer. "You're not exactly the type they usually put up here." Before Aisha could respond, a figure approached. Michelle Tran, the lead flight attendant, dressed in Horizon Star's crisp navy uniform and red scarf. Her posture was confident, but her eyes flickered toward Edward with something almost deferential. "Ma'am, first class is reserved for premium passengers," Michelle said flatly. "Please double-check your boarding pass." Aisha didn't flinch. "I just showed it to you," she replied. "Seat 2B Platinum member. Over 500,000 miles with your airline." Michelle hesitated, but only for a second. "We'll sort it out shortly," she said, already turning toward Edward. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Langston." The message was clear. Phones began to rise. Discreet but steady. One row behind, Laura Bonetta, freelance journalist, seated in 3, opened her streaming app and quietly hit Go Live. No one in the cabin spoke yet, but the air had shifted. The silence wasn't calm, it was charged, and Aisha Carter, CEO, board member, shareholder, and seasoned leader, stood facing a man who thought power gave him the right to erase someone else's seat-and dignity. "Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments below." Aisha Carter did not move. She remained standing, her posture calm but unshakable, like a lighthouse in a storm. Around her, the soft rustle of passengers shifting in their seats echoed the growing unease in the cabin. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the flight attendants continued their final boarding checks, pretending nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. She unlocked her phone again and calmly tapped through her airline app. With practiced ease, she pulled up her Horizon Star Platinum membership card clear, bold, unmistakable. She held it up for Michelle Tran to see, her voice low but unmistakably firm. "Here is my boarding pass. And my membership. Over 500,000 miles flown. I know exactly where I belong." Michelle didn't lean in. She didn't even glance at the screen. Her eyes darted to Edward Langston instead. Edward, who was now comfortably seated in 2C, one leg crossed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing of consequence were happening. The glint in his eyes said everything. He had won. Again, Michelle hesitated, just for a breath. But then she said the words that dropped like stones between them. "This could be invalid, ma'am. We've had problems with third-party bookings lately. Please remain standing until we clarify." Aisha felt the air shift. She wasn't just being delayed. She was being erased. Edward chuckled audibly, not even looking up. "Michelle, let's not waste time on this. It's obvious she's not supposed to be here." Aisha's hand didn't move, but her heart did. It clenched not from embarrassment, but from recognition. She knew this moment. She had lived it before. As a teenager trying to buy a prom dress. As a college student challenged while entering a business competition. As a young analyst mistaken for a secretary in boardrooms full of men named Charles and Greg. Now here it was again, disbelief that she could belong. Across the aisle, Laura Bennett's live stream quietly ticked upward. From under her phone, she caught the exchange clearly. The comments on X came flooding in, This is racism, plain and simple. She literally showed them the pass. Oh, why isn't the crew doing their job? A man 2 rows back muttered to his wife. If she were blonde and wearing pearls, they wouldn't even ask. His wife nodded solemnly. Aisha took a breath so deep it almost hurt. She locked eyes with Michelle. "You're choosing not to verify what's right in front of you," she said slowly. "This isn't about protocol. It's about perception." Michelle said nothing. Her hand trembled slightly as she tapped her tablet, pretending to search through the manifest. But she wasn't entering any information. She was stalling. Edward leaned over the armrest, his voice syrupy and venomous. "You people always make everything a problem. Just find another seat." That phrase, "you people," burned more than anything. Still, Aisha did not raise her voice. She simply stood straighter. Her spine seemed carved from steel. Laura's live stream hit 500 viewers. A new comment popped up. "She's the only one acting like a professional here." A child in 1D turned to her mother and whispered, "Why is that man being so mean to her?" The mother said nothing, just pulled her daughter closer. The cabin had become a mirror reverie face, reflecting either shame, complicity, or awakening. Michelle's fingers hovered once more over her device. Then she looked away, quietly speaking into her radio. "We have a disruptive passenger in first class, requesting ground support before departure." Aisha didn't flinch. But inside her, something broke hand. Something else took its place. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to explain her right to exist. She was here to make sure this moment was never ignored again. The engines hummed beneath the floor as passengers settled in, unaware that first class was no longer a sanctuary of calm, but a boiling crucible of tension. Michelle Tran gripped her serving tray tighter than necessary, the muscles in her hand rigid with hesitation. She was a veteran of 10 years, no stranger to high-maintenance flyers. But today, her professionalism was unraveling, strand by strand, in the presence of Edward Langston and the quiet storm brewing just feet away. She had served Edward before more than once. She remembered his demands for warm towels folded a certain way, champagne before takeoff, an extra seat for space. And she remembered what happened the one time she tried to push back. A complaint, a warning letter, a closed-door meeting with her supervisor who reminded her that some passengers were strategic priorities. That lesson had never left her. Now, faced with Aisha Carter's calm insistence and undeniable credentials, Michelle didn't scan the boarding pass. She didn't check the tablet. Instead, she raised her radio to her mouth and muttered, "Cabin to gate. Disruptive passenger in first class. Requesting ground team assistance." The words, false and heavy, hung in the air like a storm cloud. Across the aisle, Edward leaned back and stretched. "See what happens when people overstep," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is what you get when you let the wrong people in." Aisha blinked slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. Her silence was deafening. Laura Bennett's livestream jumped to over 1,000 viewers. The chat exploded. "He really just said that? Wrong people? Racist much? Horizon Star is done." An elderly man in 4B, gray hair slicked back, leaned over to his wife and whispered, "This is wrong. They're targeting her because she's black." His voice was low, but not low enough to go unheard. Phones lifted again. The cabin was now half witness, half jury. Michelle's voice, shaky, came again through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we resolve a seating issue. We appreciate your patience." But there was no patience. Only rising indignation. Edward wasn't done. He leaned toward Aisha with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never been told no. "You know, I've built my company from scratch. Langston Properties is one of the biggest names in Dallas. I didn't get there by pretending to be something I'm not." His eyes narrowed. "You should try that sometime." Oh, Aisha's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. To the untrained eye, she looked motionless. To anyone watching closely, she was choosing not to explode. Not yet. Michelle turned away, fiddling nervously with her device, still refusing to scan Aisha's information. She knew she could clear this up in seconds, but clearing it up would mean contradicting Edward. And Michelle Tranbattle hardened. Once Burned wasn't ready to take that risk, so she stalled. Aisha stood taller, hands by her sides, spine unbent. The hum of injustice pressed down on her from every direction, but she refused to sink. From row 2A, a young black man in his 20s looked up from his tablet. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "You good?" he asked Aisha, his tone gentle but full of meaning. She turned slightly, met his gaze, and nodded once. That nod carried lifetimes. Laura panned her phone to catch the exchange, and within seconds, the live stream hit 2,000 viewers. "She's a rock. That man is disgusting. Where's the pilot in all this?" And then, without fanfare, without logic, Edward reached across the armrest, pulled Aisha's tote off seat 2B, and dropped it unceremoniously onto the floor. "There! Problem solved!" The cabin gasped. Someone audibly said, "Oh my God." Even Michelle froze. Aisha bent down slowly, retrieving the bag with a grace that defied the insult. She set it gently back on the leather seat and looked Edward directly in the eye. The quiet fury in her gaze was enough to silence him for the first time. She didn't need volume. She didn't need threats. She just needed time. Because this injustice recorded, witnessed, and now viral was about to come undone. "You just threw her bag on the floor? What is wrong with you?" The voice came not from Aisha, but from seat 3, Alora Bennett, who had finally dropped her phone to her lap. Her voice cut through the dense silence like a fire alarm. Her journalistic instincts had kept her quietly observing until now. But the sight of Edward Langston manhandling Aisha Carter's personal belongings had snapped her composure. She stood halfway up in her seat, not yelling, but projecting with the kind of righteous clarity that made heads turn. "She showed you her boarding pass. She has status. You didn't even look at it." "This is unacceptable," Laura continued, eyes now trained on Michelle, who stood frozen, one hand still resting near her tablet, the other gripping the back of a seat like it might anchor her to sanity. The moment cracked something open. A wave of quiet murmurs surged through the first-class cabin. From 4B, the elderly white man who had whispered earlier now spoke louder, this time with unmistakable disapproval. "This feels wrong. It's not just rudeness. It's prejudice." His wife nodded sharply, crossing her arms. "If that had been me in her place, no one would have questioned a thing." Edward rolled his eyes. "Oh, please, let's not get dramatic. This has nothing to do with race. She's just being difficult." "Difficult?" came a sharp reply from across the aisle. A black woman in her 50s, seated in 3C, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. "You threw her bag and called her 'you people.' That's not difficult. That's disgraceful." More voices joined in, not loud, not hostile, but firm, insistent, resonant. The crowd, once silent and deferential, was waking up. Michelle's breathing quickened. Her eyes darted nervously from Edward to the growing number of passengers now filming, whispering, condemning. She glanced at James Carter, the new flight attendant standing near the galley, eyes wide with uncertainty. James looked barely out of his 20s, and until now had stayed quiet. But sensing the shift in the air, he stepped forward. "Miss Tran," James said gently but audibly, "maybe we should check the manifest. Just confirm her seat. It'll clear everything up." Michelle blinked, as if waking from a spell. Her lips parted to speak, but Edward interrupted. "Michelle, you know me," he said in a low, warning tone, his words sharp as broken glass. "This is my space. Don't let this get out of hand." Michelle faltered. Her grip on the tablet tightened again, but she didn't move. James hesitated, then stepped closer to Aisha, and spoke directly, kindly. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me your boarding pass one more time?" Without a word, Aisha lifted her phone and tilted it toward him. The screen glowed. "Seat 2, B, first class, platinum member." "Oh!" James looked at the pass, then at her, then at Michelle. "She's where she's supposed to be," he said clearly. The entire cabin stilled. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the rows. "Finally," someone said. "Took long enough." Others began to nod, their expressions ranging from sympathy to subtle fury. Phones were still recording. Laura picked hers back up and quietly narrated, "It's confirmed she belongs in that seat. The crew knew this the whole time." Michelle's face had gone pale. Her lips trembled as she tried to form a sentence, but the words wouldn't come. And then, from 2A, the young black man who had earlier offered a quiet, "You good?" now leaned forward and looked at Edward squarely. "Sir, maybe it's time you sat back and showed some respect." Edward, who had grown used to silence and deference from those around him, looked visibly rattled. His jaw worked, but no words came out. "Mr. Langston," the older woman in 3C added, her voice calm but cutting, "you should be ashamed. This isn't your living room. It's not your private jet. You're on a public flight, and you're not above the rules." A few passengers actually clapped. Softly at first, then more boldly. A sense of unity was beginning to form, fragile but undeniable. It wasn't just about Aisha anymore, it was about everyone who had ever seen injustice and stayed quiet, now choosing to speak. Aisha remained standing, her face still, but something shifted in her eyes. A glimmer of hope, a recognition that the tide was turning not because she demanded it, but because people were finally seeing what had always been there. Michelle stared at the tablet in her hand, still unscanned, still blank. She looked toward Aisha, then down at her own shoes. Regret hung heavy in her posture. The voice of the crowd had arrived, and now it would not be silenced. I knew I recognized her. "She's not just any passenger. That's Aisha Carter. She's the CEO of Nexus Solutions." The words came from seat 5A, spoken by a balding man in his late 60s, who had been silently observing the drama unfold with growing discomfort. Now, his voice pierced the thick air like a needle through fabric. Heads turned sharply toward him, then collectively swiveled back to Aisha. She did not flinch. Instead, Aisha slowly reached into her brown leather tote and retrieved a sleek black cardholder. Her movements were precise, deliberate, as if choreographed by conviction. She pulled out a business card thick, matte, embossed in silver. With calm certainty, she turned to Michelle, then to Edward, and finally held it up for the cabin to see. "Aisha Carter," she said clearly, "CEO of Nexus Solutions, board member of Horizon Star Airlines, platinum investor, and as of last quarter, director of customer experience and equity initiatives." A hush dropped over the cabin like a weighted blanket. The energy shifted instantly, no longer outrage, but stunned disbelief. Edward stared at her, as if the floor had opened beneath his seat. Michelle froze. Aisha's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "I am not here as a celebrity. I fly often, quietly, and by policy. But when I am told I don't belong in a seat I paid for on an airline, I help let it becomes more than personal. It becomes systemic." The words were simple, but each syllable struck with the force of a gavel. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. His fingers tightened around the armrest, his jaw grinding as if it might splinter. Michelle's face turned a shade paler. Her hand moved toward her tablet, finally ready to scan Aisha's ticket. But it was far too late for procedural gestures. From across the aisle, Laura Bennett's voice returned, now full of awe. "She's not just a CEO. She's on the board. She literally oversees customer experience." "Michelle, you denied the woman in charge of your job." James Carter stood still, looking between Aisha and Michelle. His face wore the kind of shock only felt by someone realizing they had almost become complicit in something deeply wrong. He slowly nodded in silent respect. "Wait. A young woman in 2D whispered, eyes wide. "You mean she owns part of this airline?" "Yes," replied the man in 5A. "I read about her in Forbes. She just secured a multi-billion-dollar AI-backed contract with the FAA. She's legit." Livestream numbers spiked on Laura's phone. Over 20,000 people were watching now. Comments flashed so fast they became a blur. "She owns the airline? Michelle's career is over. Edward just messed with the wrong one." Edward tried to laugh, but the sound came out brittle, like cracked glass. "I don't care what board she's on. I still paid for my ticket. I deserve comfort." "Oh." Aisha turned to him, eyes steady. "No one said you didn't. But comfort doesn't come with the right to humiliate others. You tried to take what was never your sand. You did it because of how I look." That sentence, calm, firm, unflinching, landed like a final verdict. Passengers looked at one another with expressions ranging from embarrassment to admiration. An older black woman in 4A wiped a tear discreetly from beneath her glasses. "Finally," she murmured. Michelle staggered back a step, her voice hoarse. I didn't know who you were." Aisha met her gaze, but there was no gloating in her face. Only clarity. "You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect." Those words settled over the cabin like a judgment that could not be appealed. From 3C, the older woman who had challenged Edward earlier now nodded, her voice low but resolute. "That's what we've all been saying. Respect shouldn't be earned with power. It should be given as human decency." More nods followed. Someone clapped once, then twice, and soon the entire cabin was applauding, not loudly, but with steady, grateful rhythm. Edward slumped in his seat, his presence shrinking as if the tailored suit he wore had become too heavy for him. Michelle looked away, shoulders caving in slightly. Her fingers hovered over her tablet again, but now with trembling guilt. Laura lifted her phone again. "This is the moment," she whispered to her viewers. "This is when the lie broke." And the truth stood up. Aisha slowly sat back down in seat 2B, crossing her legs with quiet grace. The cabin exhaled with her, the collective breath of dozens who had been holding tension in their chests. Her boarding pass still sat on the seat tray unscanned, but now more powerful than any verified code. Silence returned, but it was a new silence zone, filled with respect, recognition, and reckoning. Aisha Carter did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She simply exhaled and reached for her phone. The cabin still buzzed from the revelation of her identity, but Aisha had already moved to the next step. This was no longer about being right. It was about making sure no one like Edward Langston or Michelle Tran could repeat what just happened ever again. And in that silence, she began her quiet strike. Opening a folder tucked within her phone's security apps, Aisha tapped the familiar blue icon Nexus Guard. Developed in-house by her company, it was a private protocol for real-time evidence recording, encrypted storage, and immediate transmission to secure cloud servers. With a swipe, she activated audio capture. Every word, every breath, from this moment forward, would be documented. Then came a brief pause. A single, quiet moment in which she typed 2 words and hit send. Protocol Horizon, a code designed not for escalation, but for preservation. In the cockpit, a soft alert appeared on the co-pilot's console. In the back galley, Michelle's tablet buzzed subtly. James Carter's handheld device pinged, its screen flashing amber. They all saw it. Most didn't know what it meant, but the higher-ups did. Edward Langston, meanwhile, was still trying to salvage his pride. Slumped in 4C, he jabbed at his phone in frustration. "No connection?" he muttered. The Wi-Fi logo had vanished. He toggled airplane mode on and off, restarted the app, then the phone. Still nothing. "What's going on?" he hissed. Why is the Wi-Fi down? No one answered. Michelle Tran stared at her tablet. The system was responding sluggishly. A red banner across the top read, "Restricted protocol in effect. Administrative override." Her stomach dropped. She had only seen that warning once before, during a high-level in-flight investigation last year involving a racial profiling case. The result had been a suspension and a lawsuit for a colleague. Now, that same ominous warning glared back at her, and she realized with a cold weight in her chest this time, it was her name on the logs. James noticed the shift in Michelle's posture. Her hands, once confident and precise, were now trembling. She wasn't issuing orders anymore. She wasn't even speaking. She was waiting, watching, as if her fate was no longer in her hands. Meanwhile, Aisha remained seated in 2B, the picture of calm. She scrolled silently through her internal Horizon Star Access portal. As a board member, she had limited but direct access to the crew behavior feedback system. With a few taps, she pulled up Michelle Tran's personnel history. 2 prior warnings, both involving passenger complaint zone related to unequal service, the other to favoritism toward a VIP traveler. The pattern was undeniable. She saved a screenshot. Next, Aisha tapped into a different log, the internal cabin network activity. Edward's device had already pinged the system over 20 times in the last 5 minutes. He had tried to access social media, email, even call apps, all blocked. She smiled quietly, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. Protocol Horizon didn't just restrict digital access. It logged attempted breaches, secured cabin communications, and alerted the risk oversight team at headquarters. It was designed for moments exactly like this. Back in 4C, Edward was now visibly agitated. His Rolex glinted under the overhead light as he clenched his fists. "I demand to speak with someone. This airline is a joke," he muttered. From across the aisle, Laura Bennett watched him closely, her phone still running live. "He doesn't even realize he's already lost," she whispered to her viewers. "They've locked him out." Michelle finally broke her silence. She approached James, voice barely audible. "Do you think this is that protocol?" Her eyes searched his face for any reassurance. James, still new, shook his head gently. "I think it's above our clearance." Michelle nodded numbly. The pressure in the cabin was shifting again, but this time it wasn't public outcry. It was silent, technical, invisible. Aisha's phone buzzed once more. A discreet message from her executive assistant back in Chicago. "Protocol active. Legal and PR teams on standby. Airport response in motion. Let us know when to engage," she replied with a single word. "Observe." Aisha knew the storm had already begun. But her role was not to yell or fight. It was to anchor the storm in principle, and let the systems she had built do their work. Her voice was calm because her preparation had always been rooted in foresight. The camera on Laura's live stream caught a telling detail: Edward gripping the seat ahead of him, muttering under his breath, shaking slightly. For the first time, his arrogance had no outlet. He couldn't call legal. He couldn't tweet for sympathy. He couldn't rally allies. He was isolated not by violence or confrontation, but by technology and accountability. Michelle returned to the galley, sat down on the fold-down seat, and simply stared at the darkened tablet in her hands. It was no longer a tool. It had become a mirror. And in seat 2B, Aisha Carter remained still, watching the clouds outside, her reflection faintly visible in the window, her heart beat steady, her mind clear, her values intact. The strike had begun. Quietly, powerfully, unstoppably. The tension in the cabin was no longer just emotional, it had become structural. You could feel it in the posture of the crew, in the stiff silence of the passengers, in the subtle way eyes darted toward Aisha, then toward Edward, then to the aisle, expecting a verdict. And then it arrived. From the front of the cabin, a tall man in a sharply pressed navy suit stepped in. His presence was commanding, Not because of noise, but because of weight professional, calculated, unshakable. A discreet lapel pin identified him as Horizon Star Security. But most didn't need the label. His reputation often preceded him. David Coleman. Someone whispered from row 6. That's the chief of security. David moved without hesitation, tablet in hand, already briefed. He stopped beside Aisha's seat, his voice low but firm. Miss Carter, I want to sincerely apologize on behalf of Horizon Star Airlines for what has occurred today. You should never have been placed in this situation. Aisha nodded once, calm and centered. Thank you, she said simply. David turned next to Michelle, his eyes cool but direct. Miss Tran, please retrieve your personnel tablet and accompany me to the service galley. Michelle froze. She had served on this airline for over a decade and had handled everything from turbulence to emergency landings. But this moment, this quiet, procedural call-out, made her knees soften beneath her. She picked up the tablet with trembling hands and followed him wordlessly. Passengers watched in silence, not gloating, but bearing witness. There was no applause, only a deeper silence, the kind that follows a decision no one can argue with. As Michelle disappeared behind the curtain, the cabin somehow felt wider, like a pressure valve had been released. But David wasn't finished. He looked down the aisle, locking eyes with Edward Langston. Sir, your behavior has violated our passenger conduct policy. We are reassigning you to seat 4C. Please move there now. Oh. Edward's lips twitched, outrage and disbelief battling across his face. You're joking, he said, his voice high-pitched with disbelief. Do you know who I am? I don't sit in the back like some common... David didn't flinch. This is not a negotiation. If you do not comply, we will be forced to escalate. I recommend you cooperate. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who had dealt with people like Edward many times before. Edward's eyes darted across the cabin, searching for support. But none came. Not even a sympathetic glance. Only phones, lenses, quiet judgment, and that deafening silence. Finally, without a word, Edward stood. The creases in his expensive suit suddenly looked less dignified and more desperate. He gathered his jacket in jerky movements, then walked down the aisle, past Aisha, avoiding her gaze like it burned. A child in 5C whispered too loudly, "That's the man who got mad because the lady wouldn't give him her seat." Her mother hushed her quickly, but the words lingered. A loudspeaker crackled overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 819 is undergoing a brief safety protocol review. We apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience. Oh, it was a scripted announcement, but its subtext was crystal clear. This flight would not move until justice had. Applause broke out. It wasn't theatrical, but it was sincere. Passengers clapped with restraint but conviction. Some smiled. Others nodded toward Aisha. Laura's live stream spiked past 60 million viewers. She's still calm, Laura whispered, panning her phone gently. Even after all this, that's what real strength looks like. In the back galley, Michelle stood rigidly beside David. She knew what was coming: a formal review, a possible suspension, mandatory training, maybe worse. But worst of all was the echo in her mind: Aisha's words. You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with respect. That truth would stay with her. Back in the main cabin, Edward sat slumped in 4C, his shoulders rounded, his phone dark, his eyes locked out the window, as if the sky could shield him from shame. He didn't speak. He didn't protest. He didn't exist to the cabin anymore, not as a powerful man, not even as a nuisance. Just a silence where arrogance had once lived. David returned to Aisha. We've taken the appropriate steps, he said. We'll be filing an incident report. You'll have full access to it. Aisha nodded. Thank you. I just want this flight to proceed respectfully for everyone. David allowed himself the briefest smile. It already is. As he walked away, Aisha remained still, her boarding pass untouched, her phone face down, her mind focused not on victory but on vigilance. She had always known that changing systems required more than just confrontation, it demanded consistency. And while the plane sat still on the tarmac, the cabin had shifted. The hierarchy had cracked, and the system long protected by complacency was finally beginning to respond. By the time Horizon Star Flight 819 finally pushed back from the gate, the real flight had already taken off on the internet. Laura Bennett's live stream, still running from her phone in seat 3A, had exploded in reach. What started with a few dozen viewers had become a digital storm. Across X, TikTok, and Instagram, hashtags surged in waves. Respect Aisha, Horizon Star Justice, this is why we fight. Clips of Edward Langston's arrogant remarks, Michelle Tran's hesitation, and Aisha Carter's quiet resilience were reposted by celebrities, social justice advocates, airline unions, and everyday passengers alike. Some framed it as a battle between privilege and principle. Others called it the viral moment that finally exposed what so many had whispered about for years: systemic bias at 30,000 feet. Within 2 hours of departure, Horizon Star's stock had dropped over 4% on the New York Stock Exchange. Analysts cited reputational risk and consumer trust erosion. On business television, one host asked bluntly, "How many lawsuits can an airline withstand before customers say enough is enough?" By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. Black CEO confronts discrimination aboard airline she helps oversee. Board member demands accountability after viral incident. At Horizon Star headquarters, executives scrambled. The public relations team issued a cautious statement. "We are aware of a situation involving one of our board members and are reviewing it seriously." But it wasn't enough. Pressure mounted. The silence from the top only fueled the outrage online. Aisha Carter's name was now trending not just in the United States, but globally. Langston Properties, the Dallas-based real estate empire run by Edward Langston, issued their own statement just 90 minutes after the first video went viral. "Effective immediately, Mr. Langston has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. His views do not represent the values of our company." The press release was cold and corporate, but it sent a clear signal. Even old money firms were now afraid of public judgment. Edward, having finally regained connection upon landing, watched in horror as his name flooded every newsfeed. His inbox was full of emails known supportive. A longtime business partner wrote, "We're suspending all joint ventures until further notice." A former classmate tweeted, "I always knew Edward Langston had a problem with women in power. Today, the world sees it too." Meanwhile, Michelle Tran sat alone in the operations office at San Francisco International Airport, facing an internal investigator from Horizon Star's Human Relations Division. Her personnel file had been flagged. The tablet on the table showed 2 previous passenger complaints now joined by a third, marked high priority. The investigator's tone was neutral but firm. "This incident has triggered a formal review. You will be placed on temporary reassignment pending results. Additionally, you will be required to complete bias awareness and equity response training." Michelle nodded silently. No protest. Just the crushing realization that she'd become part of the problem she thought she was managing. Aisha, seated quietly in the Sky Gold Lounge at SFO, connected to a secure call with Horizon Star's board of directors. Her tone was calm, but the words were unyielding. "This isn't about embarrassment," she said. "It's about liability, accountability, and the human cost of turning a blind eye. I'm requesting the following. 1. A permanent diversity oversight council with independent authority. 2. Mandatory equity and bias training across all departments. And 3. A transparent complaint tracking system accessible to passengers." No one interrupted. The board chair finally cleared his throat. Consider your proposals adopted. We'll begin implementation immediately. End of 2. Aisha ended the call, closed her laptop, and sat back. At CNN's newsroom, a producer reviewed footage from Laura's live stream, now downloaded and re-uploaded with commentary. A lower third banner read, "Black Woman CEO Forces Accountability Mid-Flight." MSNBC aired a roundtable with civil rights leaders, one of whom said, "What Aisha did isn't just brave, it's strategic. She used the system she helped build to call it to account. That's leadership." And Bloomberg Businessweek published a feature article within 12 hours. The Carter Doctrine: How One CEO is Forcing Aviation to Confront Its Bias Problem. Their reporters revealed that Horizon Star had quietly settled $2.5 million in discrimination-related claims over the previous year, figures never publicly disclosed until now. In 2024 alone, the airline had logged 132 passenger complaints, citing racial or class-based mistreatment, 38% above the industry average. The data sent shockwaves. So did the silence that followed. Passengers and watchdog groups demanded answers. Media anchors posed hard questions. Why did it take a board member being mistreated for real change to begin? And still, Aisha Carter never gave a press conference. She didn't tweet a victory thread. She didn't record a dramatic video statement. Instead, she let the actions speak. In her suite overlooking the bay, she quietly reviewed a summary of incoming legal requests. 3 passengers had asked to testify on her behalf if hearings emerged. 5 others had submitted formal complaints inspired by the incident. One mother from Seat 5C had sent her a handwritten thank you note, scrawled in childlike letters by her daughter. "Thank you for being strong." That, Aisha thought, was the only headline that truly mattered. The flight may have landed, but the impact had only begun to climb. As the wheels touched the runway in San Francisco and the plane taxied toward the gate, the cabin finally settled into a heavy stillness, not of tension, but of reflection. Phones were still clutched tightly, screens glowed with paused recordings and comment threads, but no one was speaking. It was as if the aircraft had become something more than metal and wings, a vessel that had carried not just passengers, but a shift in consciousness. Then, from Seat 2B, Aisha Carter stood up. She didn't raise her voice or call attention to herself. She simply turned toward the aisle, her posture calm, her expression composed, and spoke with the clarity and purpose of someone who knew her words would live far beyond this moment. "Respect is not a perk," she began, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of cabin disembarkation preparations. "It is not a courtesy extended based on wealth, skin color, or social status. It is a right tone that every human being is entitled to, in every seat, on every flight, in every walk of life." The cabin went still again. No one moved. No overhead bins clicked open. Every eye locked on her. Even those who had previously looked away now sat up straighter. Aisha didn't need a script. Her words came from something deeper: experience, pain, resilience, and resolve, all braided together into calm defiance. "I will always speak up," she continued, "not because I seek attention, but because silence lets these patterns continue, and I will fight quietly, firmly, and unapologetically until this industry, and others like it, choose fairness over familiarity, courage over comfort." Near the front, a young man in a Horizon Star uniform, likely a trainee, nodded without realizing it. Behind him, an older woman pressed her hand to her chest, eyes glistening. In Seat 4C, Edward Langston sat frozen, still staring out the window, but no longer in denial. His reflection on the glass was no longer that of a confident CEO. It was a man unmasked by a truth he couldn't twist. From the galley, Michelle Tran overheard every word. She didn't peek out. She didn't interrupt. But each syllable sank into her like a stone into water, rippling through 10 years of routine, of protocols followed half blindly, of pressure absorbed without question. Aisha wasn't accusing her directly, but she didn't have to. The mirror had already been held up. A child in seat 5D whispered, "Mom, is she a superhero?" Her mother smiled softly and replied, "She's something even stronger." And still, Aisha kept speaking, not louder, just steadier. "I don't care about titles. I don't need apologies whispered after the fact. What I want, what I demand is a system where no one has to prove their worth just to be treated like they belong. If this flight proved anything, it's that the silence of others can be as dangerous as the cruelty of one." That sentence, the final chord in a speech that had no theatrics, no finger-pointing, reverberated through the cabin with a gravity words rarely achieve. Laura Bennett, still recording quietly, angled her phone to capture Aisha's silhouette against the cabin lighting. Within minutes, that clip would be shared over 100,000 times, with captions like, "This is how you lead." She turned pain into power. A soft murmur of assent spread through the cabin. Not applause, just acknowledgement. Several passengers reached for their phones, not to scroll but to document this moment of truth. A few wiped their eyes discreetly. One mansolent throughout the entire flight simply nodded at Aisha as if to say, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Aisha sat back down with a quiet exhale, her eyes drifting toward the window. Beyond the glass, the gate was approaching, but her gaze wasn't fixed on the terminal. It was reaching somewhere further. Not just where she had to be for the investor meeting that afternoon, but where she had to lead an industry that for too long mistook exclusivity for excellence. On the live stream, comments flew in at dizzying speed. She didn't just win an argument, she rewrote the rules. That speech gave me chills. And hope. Can we elect her to something bigger? One particularly poignant comment simply read, "That's what my mother fought for. Aisha just reminded me why." In the following hours, media outlets clipped the speech into highlight reels. It aired on CNN, was quoted in the New York Times, and became a viral video under the title, "The Words That Grounded an Industry." Back in the crew galley, Michelle sat alone. She had already spoken with HR. She would undergo bias response training, and she wasn't sure what her future held. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. She pulled up the clip on her tablet, rewatched it, and whispered to herself, "I let pressure blur my judgment, but I won't let it define me." For Aisha Carter, the moment wasn't about a seat, or even the spotlight. It was about the principle that dignity is non-negotiable, and if her voice could help someone else find theirs, then it had all been worth it. The plane stopped. The seatbelt signs chimed off. But no one rushed to stand. It was as if something sacred had passed through this cabin. Something that asked everyone, crew, passengers, even those watching through a screen, what kind of world are you helping to build? And in that hush, Aisha's words didn't fade. They echoed. Less than 72 hours after Horizon Star Flight 819 landed in San Francisco, the ripple effects had become tidal waves. In Chicago, the airline's boardroom, usually reserved for quarterly reviews and budget forecasts, was packed wall to wall. Executives, HR leaders, diversity consultants, and outside legal counsel sat in tense silence as Aisha Carter, now back in her own city, stood at the head of the long glass conference table. She wore the same crisp white blazer from the flight, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder that the seat she had to fight for represented thousands more who never got to speak. Her tone was calm, not accusatory, but the message was unshakable. "What happened on Flight 819 wasn't an exception," she began. "It was a symptom, and if we don't treat the system, not just the incident, we've learned nothing." Aisha proposed sweeping changes, mandatory anti-discrimination training for all 12,000 Horizon Star employees, the establishment of an independent customer experience oversight council with public-facing reporting powers, a formal audit of all passenger complaints filed in the past 3 years, and a hotline run by a third-party firm for whistleblowers to report racial or class-based mistreatment without fear of retaliation. There were no objections. Within 48 hours, the company issued a press release titled, "Respect is our altitude," announcing every measure Aisha had outlined word for word. Michelle Tran, once the face of unspoken compliance, sat in a windowless conference room on the 33rd floor of the Horizon Star Tower. She was undergoing bias recognition training alongside 10 other senior crew members. But she wasn't just sitting quietly. When prompted to reflect on past mistakes, Michelle stood and addressed the room. "I was afraid," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Afraid of disappointing VIPs, of losing my job, of being labeled insubordinate, and that fear made me forget the one duty that matters, most treating every person with respect. I failed, Miss Carter, but I'm here now because I'm learning how not to fail again." End of quote. That clip, recorded discreetly by the instructor and later approved for internal training, became a cornerstone in Horizon Star's new crew onboarding program. Meanwhile, Edward Langston's empire unraveled. Langston Properties held an emergency board meeting after losing 3 major clients in 2 days. Video from the flight had been replayed across every news network, captioned with headlines like, "CEO's arrogance grounds his fortune," and "How one man's ego cost millions." In the end, Edward was forced to resign. Public statements were issued, assets quietly liquidated. Invitations to future panels and elite real estate conferences were revoked. What once made Edward powerful, his last name, his connections, his confidence-sino, rendered him toxic. And yet, Aisha Carter never once called for his downfall. In fact, she declined every interview request that focused on Edward's punishment. When asked by Bloomberg why she hadn't publicly condemned him, she replied simply, "Justice is about creating accountability, not enemies. I didn't speak out to destroy a man. I spoke out to rebuild a system." That philosophy became the guiding force behind the transformation not just of Horizon Star, but of an industry. Within weeks, Delta Airlines and United followed suit with policy overhauls, crediting the Carter framework as their blueprint. Respect Aisha remained the #1 trending hashtag on LinkedIn and X for 13 consecutive days. Business schools began building case studies. Aisha received nominations for several prestigious leadership awards and declined them all. "I'm not interested in medals," she said at a press conference attended by over 300 reporters. "What matters is that no 12-year-old black girl, watching this unfold, grows up believing she must become a CEO just to sit in her rightful seat." Oh. In her office at Nexus Solutions, overlooking Lake Michigan, Aisha kept the boarding pass for Seat 2B framed on her shelf. It was slightly crumpled from the flight. The barcode faded from sunlight, but it held a gravity beyond paper. To her, it represented a quiet rebellion that had echoed far beyond 30,000 feet. Staff at Horizon Star began to notice the difference. Gate agents double-checked seating disputes. Flight attendants leaned into uncomfortable conversations. Executives began inviting employees from all backgrounds into policy discussions. The change was subtle but constant. Not loud, but deliberate. Like Aisha herself. One day, a young employee at the airline's training center approached Michelle Tran during a break. "Miss Tran," he said gently, "I heard what happened, and I just wanted to say thank you for owning it. That's leadership too." Michelle smiled. It wasn't relief, it was responsibility. For Edward Langston, silence became his final currency. His calls went unanswered. His former colleagues avoided eye contact in public. At night, he sat alone in his high-rise, watching clips of the flight he wished he could forget. The man who once measured respect in square footage and shareholder returns now faced the cost of what he'd never valued: human dignity. But Aisha Carter wasn't focused on him. She was preparing for a new initiative, a coalition between Nexus Solutions, Horizon Star, and civil rights organizations to create a digital passenger equity dashboard across major U.S. carriers, a tool that wouldn't just track complaints but prevent them. Her work was just beginning, and yet, for millions who followed her story, Aisha's most powerful contribution wasn't a policy or app. It was that she stood up when it would have been easier to sit down, that she spoke calmly when others shouted, that she demanded respect without demanding revenge. Because, in a world still learning how to listen, her courage became the clearest voice in the sky.